Mr. Chameleon in The Case of Murder and the $1 Million Smile. Tonight we again present the famous Mr. Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters in another of his celebrated cases of crime and murder. Mr. Chameleon, as you know, is the dreaded detective who frequently uses a disguise to track down a killer, a disguise which at all times is recognized by the audience. Tonight, The Case of Murder and the $1 Million Smile. The opening scene of tonight's murder case is the drawing room of a richly appointed mansion overlooking Gramercy Park. The master of the house, the elderly philanthropist, Julian Ford, has sent who share his home. And now as they enter the drawing room, the old man smiles at them, little and horrible consequences.
Come in, children. Come in.
You wanted to see us, Uncle Julian?
Nothing is wrong, I hope, sir.
In fact, I have news for you and Ethel, which I'm sure will please you very much. Ethel, you and your husband have shared my home for some time now.
Oh, you've been very generous to us, Uncle Julian.
Nonsense. It's good for a loan. And now, in a few hours, we shall have an additional member to our little household.
An additional member?
Yes, Alan. I'm bringing a guest here. A young woman named Jennifer Gray. And
What are you saying, Uncle Julian?
Who is this Jennifer Gray?
well, she's a girl I met some weeks ago when I was taking my walk in Gramercy Park. I've seen her every day since then. She's a waitress at a little restaurant down...
You're here, to this house, to live?
Yes, Ethel, dear. She has no family or friends. And not much education, I'm afraid. But her smile. Why, the moment I saw that warm, ingratiating smile of hers, I felt drawn to her. I felt toward her as if she was the daughter...
And we understand how you must feel and how kind you always are. But this girl, you know nothing about her.
She's probably a conniving little fortune hunter, taking advantage of an old...
I assure you, Alan, she's a sweet, innocent child whom I shall bring here and perhaps someday even adopt as my daughter.
Uncle Julian, we realize how generous you are.
Too generous, perhaps, for your own good, Uncle. This young woman could be dangerous. She's a total stranger, and to bring her into this...
I'm the master of it. Now, I'm picking up Jennifer Gray at her rooming house at 7 this evening and bringing her home with me. And
As you wish, of course, Uncle Julian.
Naturally, sir.
I'm going to the study. I'll see you both later.
This is outrageous.
I always knew your uncle was eccentric, Ethel, but now he's gone stark, raving mad.
Alan, if he adopts this dreadful girl, he'll leave his money to her. Every penny of it, probably. She'll be getting money that belongs to us. Money I've waited for all these years, and I won't be cheated out of it. I won't, I tell you, I won't.
Your Uncle Julian is a fool.
What are we going to do, Alan? He's bringing her here at 7 o'clock.
Don't worry, my dear. She won't be coming here at 7 o'clock. Word, Ethel, Jennifer Gray will never set foot inside this house.
Now, promptly at 7 o'clock that evening, Jennifer Gray has a rented room, and he is greeted by the landlady, Mrs. Hester Krebs, who says to him,
Jennifer, come on, I'll go along with you. I want to say goodbye to her.
Thank you, Mrs. Krebs.
Oh, you know, Mr. Ford, ain't many girls alone in New York who are as lucky as she is.
I'm the one who's lucky, Mrs. Krebs, to have met a girl like Jennifer Gray. What a sweet, lovely child. She has the nicest smile I've ever seen. So...
Well, looks like it's turned out to be. Well, she deserves a break. She's real excited about going to live in that big, elegant house of yours. Here we are. This is her room.
Jennifer, my dear, it's Mr. Ford. I've come for you.
That's queer.
Jennifer, are you in there?
Jennifer, why didn't you... Oh, Mr. Ford, look. There on the bed. Oh, it's Jennifer Gray.
Dear heaven. There's a knife in her throat. Mrs. Crab, call the police. Hurry. The poor girl's been murdered.
Now, half an hour later, we find Mr. Chameleon, the famed and dreaded detective, and his assistant, Detective Dave Arnold, in the murdered girl's room. Mr. Chameleon says,
Dave, Jennifer Gray was stabbed to death sometime shortly before 7 o'clock tonight.
Looks as though.
Overturned bureau drawers, papers scattered over the floor. Whoever was here must have been looking for something.
This is horrible, Mr. Chameleon. Horrible.
You're Julian Ford, aren't you? The millionaire with a reputation for helping people.
Well, I made my money through pure good luck, Mr. Chameleon, when they found copper on some property I owned. I always felt I wanted to...
Like Jennifer Gray, for instance?
Yes. I have a house on Gramercy Park where my niece, Ethel, and her husband live with me. And I'd invited Jennifer to stay with me, too.
How well did you know the murdered girl, Mr. Ford?
Well, I was attracted by her simplicity and charm, and we became great friends. And now she's been murdered, and it's my fault.
Your fault, Mr. Ford?
Because if I'd arrived half an hour earlier, she might never have been murdered.
Mr. Chameleon, I found this on the floor.
Oh, let's have it, Dave. Obviously expensive. Mrs. Crebb, you're the landlady here?
That's right, Mr. Chameleon, and I run the pawn shop next door. There's only one I knew of, Mickey Collins. And they had a terrible fight last night.
A quarrel? What about?
How should I know, Mr. Chameleon? But I heard them arguing up here in her room. He found a pocket, number 712.
Dave, have Mickey Collins picked up and brought to police headquarters with Jennifer Gray, and if it led to her murder.
Jennifer's dead. I loved her.
Come now, Mickey Collins, pull yourself together.
You had a fight with Jennifer Gray the night before her death. Maybe you wound up that fight by killing her.
That's a lie. Yes, I went to see Jennifer last night, sure, but I didn't quarrel with her. I wanted her to go back to Cedar Springs with me, Mr. Chameleon. Jennifer and I grew up there together.
And when she wouldn't go back, you threatened...
Tell you, last month, she left town and came here to New York without any explanation. I followed her and traced her here to the rooming house last night. She was living in terror of her life.
In terror of her life, Collins? What did she mean?
She told me she'd found out something and wanted to go to the police. But she was afraid to. Afraid and pleaded, but she wouldn't explain.
That sounds like a phony yarn to me, Collins. It's much more likely you got angry and jealous because she was going to live in that millionaire's house. So jealous it drove you to murder.
That's not true, Detective Arnold. Sure, I wanted to marry Jennifer. But I was...
Possibly, Collins. Or, as Detective Arnold suggests, you may have wanted to stop her from walking out of your life and invented the story of her being terrified. But that remains to be seen. You may go for the present.
Pretty emotional guy, that Mickey Collins.
Yes, but he could be telling the truth, Dave. A young... But afraid of whom? And why? Dave, let's drive over to Julian Ford's house. I'd like to have another talk with him.
And meanwhile, in the drawing room of the home of the millionaire philanthropist, Julian Ford, his niece, Ethel, is...
Ellen! Ellen, where in heaven's name have you been?
Keep your voice down, will you, Ethel? Where's your uncle?
Uncle Julian's in the study. Oh, Ellen, that him?
Yes, what about her?
She was found murdered, stabbed to death at her rooming house. Uncle Julian came home a few minutes ago and told me that Detective Mr. Chameleon is on the case.
Chameleon? He's supposed to...
Won't have to worry about Jennifer Gray threatening our security any longer. We can... Alan, what's the matter?
Ethel, listen, comes here. I want you to tell him I didn't leave this house all day.
But that isn't true. Alan, where have you been since 5 o'clock?
Never mind that. But you're to tell this Detective Chameleon I was in this house all day. Can you get that through your head, Ethel? My very life may depend on what you say to him.
Mr. Chameleon in The Case of Murder and the $1 Million Smile will return in just a moment. A refreshing note about the music baritone Donald Richards as host There's music in the air tonight offers a wonderful lineup of Viennese favorites with Alfredo Antonini's orchestra playing strictly from Danube melodies. Another new musical, Can Can. Tenor Clark Dennis, soprano Francis Greer, vocal Eddie Johnson and the Serenaders join in the festa presented by CBS Radio later tonight. And now, back to Mr. Chameleon in The Case of Murder and the $1 Million Smile. Death in her rented room just before moving to the home of the rich philanthropist Julian Owens, who was in love with her, that Jennifer feared for her life. Now, at Julian is at her husband, who is saying to her tensely,
Ethel, when Mr. Chameleon gets here, you ought to tell him I didn't leave this house all day.
But, Alan, that's not true. You went out of the house at 5 o'clock, right after Uncle Julian told us about his bringing Jennifer Gray here to live with us. Where did you go? Where have you been?
Never mind that. You ought to say that I depend on it.
That is a very interesting statement, Mr. Alan Drake.
What?
Who are you? And that man with you?
I'm Detective Arnold, and this is Mr. Chameleon of the police.
Oh, Mr. Chameleon.
And you, I take it, are Julian Ford's niece, Ethel, and this is your husband.
How did you get in here?
Yes, we didn't hear you.
Obviously not, Mr. Drake. However, Detective Arnold and I heard you very clearly, asking hardly. And a man doesn't need an alibi unless he's hiding something, like murder, for instance.
No, Alan didn't kill Jennifer Gray.
Be quiet, Ethel. Mr. Chameleon, what you're suggesting is ridiculous. A total stranger.
Perhaps for a very logical motive, Alan Drake. Self-protection.
Self-protection.
Perhaps even planning to legally adopt her as his daughter.
Why?
As matters now stand, your wife inherits Julian Ford's entire fortune. However, if Jennifer Gray had come here, had been adopted by him, you...
No right to say that. We didn't resent that girl coming here. When Uncle Julian told us, we were delighted about it.
Of course we were.
Mr. Drake, Detective Arnold and I overheard you warning your wife to tell us that you hadn't left her. Where were you between 5 o'clock and 7 this evening?
I was out because I didn't want to become a suspect in that girl's murder.
You've already made yourself a very strong suspect, Mr. Drake. You had plenty of time to go to Jennifer Gray's room and stab her.
No, he didn't. Alan wouldn't.
And as for you, Mrs. Drake, you also had a motive. The threat of losing your inheritance, and with it possibly your husband's love as well.
Oh, stop it. I didn't go near Jennifer Gray's rooming house.
And neither did I.
It's no use, my boy. Tell them the truth.
Uncle Julian.
Come in, please, Mr. Ford.
Alan, if you'll be honest with Mr. Chameleon, we can help you.
What are you trying to do? Involve me in murder?
Oh, you're already involved, Alan. Mr. Chameleon already knows you were in Jennifer Gray's room.
This is your lighter, isn't it, Mr. Drake? It has the initials A.D. engraved on it.
All right. Yes, it's mine. Believe me.
Alan.
I went to see her to persuade her to change her mind about coming to live here. When I opened the door to her room, she was lying across the bed with a knife in her throat. It was horrible.
Oh.
And I didn't call the police because I didn't want her murder pinned on me.
Alan. Oh, Alan, you said that she would never set foot in this house, but I never dreamt you meant to...
Ethel, you little fool. I told you I didn't kill her. What are you trying to do, send me to the electric chair?
All I wanted was to help that girl.
Mr. Chameleon, look. I found something. Here, take it.
What is it, Mr. Chameleon?
A bracelet, Dave. A diamond bracelet.
What? What would a girl like Jennifer Gray be doing with a diamond bracelet? Uncle Julian, had you been...
Certainly not.
I doubt if your uncle gave her this one at any rate. This bracelet looks like some jewelry that was reported stolen some weeks ago.
Stolen? Oh, no. No, I don't believe it.
The fact this bracelet was discovered in her room doesn't mean that she stole it, Mr. Ford. As for you, Alan, I have not arrested you yet. But don't leave the house until you hear from me.
I swear I'm innocent, Mr. Chameleon. I swear it.
Bracelet. I don't get it.
I think I'm beginning to get it now, Dave. When we get to headquarters, I want you to check on something. Case. The one she was in the middle of packing when she was murdered. I've a feeling an important clue may be in that suitcase.
And later at Central Police Headquarters, Mr. Chameleon is in the office of the